A search was launched that night. And then, what the rescue team found the next morning stunned everyone. A circle of massive grizzlies stood watch around his unconscious body, and whatever had happened in the hours before the rescue team arrived would shake the foundations of what scientists thought they knew about wild instinct. Luke Brennan was no ordinary ranger. Known for his steady hands and razor-sharp instincts, he was a familiar figure along Trail 17. Every morning, long before the sun crept over the horizon, he'd set off alone on a familiar route through the rugged terrain of Bitterroot National Forest. That morning was supposed to be no different. Just a simple check of a few trail cameras, make sure the path was safe, and be back before nightfall. But as the sun struggled to pierce the dense canopy, fate was already scribbling a very different script. His truck rumbled gently as he eased it down the narrow, winding path. The cold mountain air slapped against his cheeks when he pulled over near a rough trailhead. Slinging his backpack over one shoulder, radio crackling faintly with static, Luke began his hike. The forest was wrapped in an eerie stillness. Only the soft whisper of wind through towering pines broke the silence. Then, on a lonely stretch of trail that felt almost too quiet, everything changed. Without warning, his boots slipped on a thin layer of frost covering the hard ground. One moment he was upright, the next he was tumbling down a slope, crashing through low branches and jagged rocks. His cry was swallowed by the wind rushing through the trees. When his body finally came to a stop, it landed on a bed of dry pine needles and loose stone, as if the forest itself had caught him. Pain exploded in his shoulder and head. His radio, that faithful lifeline, now lay silent and broken beside him. Luke was unconscious, lost to the world around him. Hours passed in a haze of silence, until the pale light of dawn began to filter through the thick canopy above. When the search team, led by fellow ranger Aaron Miller, finally traced his location, they found Luke face down at the edge of Trail 17. His uniform was shredded, his face pale as if all life had drained from it. But what stopped everyone in their tracks wasn't the condition he was in. It was what surrounded him. A wide ring of grizzly bears had gathered in total silence. The scene had an almost surreal quality to it. Towering, wild, majestic creatures stood motionless, like statues. Their eyes, deep, dark, ancient, held something raw and timeless, as if they carried the very soul of the forest within them. Forming a loose semicircle around Luke's unconscious body, their heavy breaths clouded in the cold morning air. One older bear, clearly aged with a silvered muzzle and a slow, deliberate gait, stepped forward. Its eyes locked onto Luke with an intensity that was startling in a wild animal. Officer Miller, hands trembling with fear, could do nothing but stand frozen. He tried to recall his training, the drills, the bear encounter protocols. But nothing had prepared him for this. Wild animals not attacking, but standing guard over an injured human. The old bear shifted its weight and let out a low, steady growl that echoed softly through the unnervingly still forest. Younger bears, maybe curious cubs, moved slightly closer, their steps cautious and slow. In that hushed moment, the line between human and nature blurred. No one knew how long the grizzlies had been there. The team speculated they might have been drawn by the scent of blood, or perhaps by some primal instinct to protect the fallen. The entire forest seemed to hold its breath as the bears continued to stand vigil. Though Luke lay unconscious, the bears showed no aggression. They didn't lunge or roar. Instead, they seemed to shield him, almost as if they were keeping him safe. Officer Miller, his voice barely above a whisper, said, "They're not attacking, they're protecting him." The words drifted into the air beneath the heavy pine branches, and in that moment the search party felt a powerful blend of awe, fear, and gratitude. As the morning light grew stronger, the bears slowly retreated back into the forest, leaving behind only a silent promise that, in its own mysterious way, the wilderness sometimes looks after its own. When Luke finally came to, blinking at a world now somehow more brutal and more compassionate, he could barely remember what had happened. The rescue team gently carried him to safety, unaware that this baffling encounter was only the beginning of a story that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the bond between humans and the wild. The morning after Luke's rescue, Ranger Erin Miller sat alone in the observation tower, eyes fixed on the security feed from Trail 17. Her hands trembled, not from the cold, but from memory. What she had witnessed the day before hadn't just confused her. It had changed her. At least 5 bears, 4 younger ones, 1 older. Not a single one attacked. Not a single one showed fear. They circled Luke's body like sentries, unmoving even as people approached. It didn't make sense. Not by the book. Not by science. Not by anything she had learned in over a decade out here. Back at the ranger station, Luke Brennan was awake. Bruised, battered, with stitches lining his right shoulder, but alive. He sat on the bed under the soft hum of fluorescent lights, staring at his hands. He couldn't recall the exact moment he fell. There was only a vague memory of cold, darkness. Then, something warm, silent. But there had been a presence. Massive, breathing. He kept telling himself it must have been a dream. But Erin's voice at the door told a different story. "You were surrounded," she said. "They didn't leave you." Luke blinked. "What?" "Bears," she said gently. "Grizzlies. They formed a circle around you until we got there. They didn't try to hurt you. One even stepped between us and your body when we arrived." He looked at her, waiting for a crooked smile, a joke. Nothing came. She placed a small flash drive on the table beside him. Trailcam caught part of it. By that afternoon, the footage had made its way through every ranger's inbox and up the chain to Montana Wildlife Authority. The video was grainy but clear enough, a massive grizzly stepping out from behind a tree, sniffing the air, then lying down beside Luke's motionless body. 2 younger bears wandered nearby, then stopped, calm, watchful. The old bear shifted position when Erin's flashlight beam entered the frame. That moment, just before the cubs began to retreat, etched itself into the minds of everyone who saw it. The bear looked straight into the camera. No panic, no fear, but purpose. The story didn't stay quiet for long. Within 48 hours, it had leaked to a local outdoor blog, then a wildlife site, then national news. Headlines blared, "Grizzlies guard ranger in Montana wilderness, miracle on Trail 17, bears or guardians." Reporters called it unbelievable. Experts offered no definitive explanation. But for those who were there, who saw it with their own eyes, this wasn't just a story. It was something else entirely. That night, as Luke tried to sleep, fragments of memory began to surface, brief, disjointed flashes, the warm brush of thick fur against his hip, the soft rasp of breath near his ear, the heavy weight of a massive body pressed close, shielding him from the bitter cold, and then a long, deep exhale. Not a growl, more like a sigh, heavy, worn. Luke jolted upright, heart pounding. This wasn't just a rescue, it was intentional. Technically, Luke wasn't allowed back on Trail 17. He was still on medical leave, shoulder not yet fully healed. The Wildlife Authority had ordered a full report, a psychological evaluation, and strict restrictions against entering high-risk zones. But something deep in those woods called to him, louder than any regulation. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't pride. It was unfinished business. So, one crisp early morning, 3 weeks after the fall that nearly killed him, Luke quietly packed a light bag, borrowed a patrol vehicle without signing it out, and drove alone into the forest. The woods hadn't changed, cold, vast, unknowable. But they felt different now, not exactly dangerous, not exactly safe. Awake, like the forest itself was watching. Branches seemed to lean closer. Each gust of wind whispered old, forgotten memories. He returned to the very curve where his boots had once slipped. The slope was just as steep, the thin layer of ice still clinging stubbornly to the trail. A new wooden sign had been posted nearby, "Caution, unstable trail, do not enter." Luke ignored it. He moved slowly, cautiously, and when he reached the spot where they had found him, a shallow dip in the terrain, bushes flattened, he stopped. The clearing was silent, eerily still. No sign of struggle, no blood, no footprints. But something else caught his eye. Just to his right, etched deep into the soft bark of a birch tree, were claw marks, 3 long, deliberate lines. Not the panicked scrape of an animal in distress. Too precise, too intentional. They weren't fresh, but not old either. Luke stepped closer and placed his hand over them. They were almost the same width as the old Grizzly's paw, and they pointed inward, straight toward the patch of earth where he had once lain, as if marking the spot, a sign, or maybe a warning. He turned to leave, then froze. At the edge of the slope above the clearing, no more than 50 feet away, stood a solitary figure, a bear cub, smaller than the adults he remembered, lighter in color, wide eyes, unmoving, watching, just watching. Luke held his breath, not out of fear, but recognition. It was one of the cubs from that day, now older, but unmistakable. They stared at each other in silence. Seconds stretched, heavy with something sacred. Then the cub stepped forward. One small step, then sat down. No aggression, no fear, just presence, as if to say, "I remember." Luke slowly reached into his coat and pulled out a granola bar, not to feed the bear, not as bait, just something placed between them, a small gesture of connection. He knelt, gently set the bar on a flat stone, and backed away. The cub didn't move, didn't react, but its head tilted slightly, its breath misted in the cold air, and in that moment Luke felt it again. The same weight, the same calm he'd known that night, when thick fur had pressed against his side, when soft breaths slowed his racing heart, when a wild creature chose not to end his life, but to shield it. He left the clearing without a word, quiet and utterly changed. The next time Luke returned, he brought something different. Not food, not equipment, something older than both. A small leather pouch, weathered, faded, bound with a simple sinew cord. Inside was a tiny bell. The bell had once been part of a collar fitted to a bear cub, tranquilized and rescued from poachers 2 years earlier. The rewilding mission had failed, and the collar had been abandoned. But Luke remembered that bear. He remembered its eyes, wild, yes, but not angry, just lost. Alone. The cub never came back. But somehow, it no longer felt like something disconnected. It felt linked, connected. Luke returned to the same slope, the same bend where he'd first locked eyes with the young bear. This time, the air was colder. The forest was soaked with meltwater and scattered patches of lingering snow. Branches drooped under the weight of wetness and silence. Every step Luke took seemed deliberate, measured. And when he reached the familiar clearing, he saw the flat stone, the very one where he'd left the granola bar days ago. It was gone, but in its place, a pine cone, neatly set, centered, as if placed there by someone or something with intention. Luke blinked slowly, stepped closer. He knew this wasn't random. He knelt, took out the leather pouch and placed it exactly where the pine cone had rested. He said nothing, expected nothing. But his heart pounded like a war drum. He sat beneath a nearby tree and waited, for over an hour, just listening, just watching. The forest wasn't quiet anymore. It was alert, and then, just as the sunset painted the treetops gold, the bear cub appeared. Same slope, same legs. But this time, no hesitation. It stepped forward. Slow, heavy, deliberate. It approached the stone, sniffed the pouch, nudged it once with its nose, then looked directly at Luke. Not to ask permission, but to be acknowledged. Then it sat down and stayed. For 20 silent minutes, man and bear. Just breathing in the same deep woods air. Eventually, the cub rose, turned, and slipped back into the trees. The pouch remained on the stone, unmoved, but not rejected. It had been accepted. Luke kept returning in the days that followed. He never brought food, never carried a camera, only himself. Sometimes the cub appeared, sometimes it didn't. But always, the pouch remained where he'd left it. Occasionally, it had been moved. Once, it was covered with leaves. Another time, it was encircled by smooth, flat stones, arranged in a perfect ring. Luke never told anyone about this. He couldn't, because what he was part of now wasn't science. It was ritual, a wordless conversation, and then, on the 5th return, something changed. The air was heavier, and from deep in the forest, there was movement. Slow, silent, but unmistakable. A bear stepped out, then another, much larger. Darker fur, a scar stretched along her muzzle, unmistakable. The mother bear, the one from that night. She stood quietly behind the cub. No growl, no charge, just watching, as if the entire forest held its breath with her. The young bear moved to the stone, nudged the pouch, then turned to glance back at her. But the mother didn't react. Her gaze never left Luke, unwavering. Luke slowly rose, took a step back, then placed his hand on his chest. Not for show, but because it hurt, as if his heart understood something before his mind could catch up. And in her eyes, he knew. This wasn't about territory anymore, not about instinct or curiosity. This was memory, something passed down, held, honored. And somehow, Luke had become part of it. He moved more quietly now, walked more slowly. Still lived in the same old cabin on the park's edge. Still wore the uniform when duty called. But his heart no longer belonged to maps or budget meetings. It lived in the forest now, somewhere between the claw marks on the birch and the leather pouch on the stone. He didn't speak of it anymore. Not even to Erin, who had been there since the beginning. She too had fallen silent. But in places like Madison County, Stories don't stay buried long, and eventually the wrong person heard the right rumor at just the right time. Dr. Micah Ward was a young biologist from Missoula, ambitious, sharp, and with more field experience than many tenured academics. The year before, he'd made waves with a paper on cognitive empathy in apex predators, particularly grizzlies. So when he heard whispers of a ranger who'd been protected by wild bears and who kept returning to meet them, Ward couldn't resist the pull. He made a few calls, got a name, traced the path into the forest, and then, unannounced, he showed up. That Tuesday morning, as light filtered faintly through the trees, Luke heard a second set of footsteps on the damp forest floor. He had just placed a small stone beside the leather pouch, a simple gesture, nothing more, when he turned and saw a figure stepping into the clearing. Windbreaker, camera slung around his neck. Luke's heart sank. "This isn't a place you should be," he said, voice calm but firm. The man didn't hesitate. "I had to see it for myself. I'm Dr. Ward, from the university." Luke didn't invite him, but he didn't send him away either, and Ward knew that was enough. Luke glanced around the woods, sensing it immediately, the shift in the air, a quiet alertness spreading through the trees like the forest itself was listening. The silence wasn't peace anymore. It was thick with meaning. And then it happened. A flicker of movement on the slope. The young bear emerged first, but this time it wasn't alone. Behind it, the scar-muzzled mother stepped into the light, her presence calm, but unmistakably commanding. No aggression, no fear, just presence. Both stood, watching. Luke whispered, "Don't move. Don't take a photo." But it was too late. Ward had already raised the camera. Click. The sound was small but piercing. Everything froze. The mother bear shifted, stepping between her cub and the two men. The cub exhaled. Not a growl, but a low, pointed sound. A warning. Luke stepped forward, placing himself slightly between Ward and the bears. Then, in a voice like mist, he said, "It's all right. We're not here to take anything, only to give something back." He knelt, touched the leather pouch once more, as if reaffirming that truth, then stepped back. The mother watched him, eyes deep and unreadable. And after a long moment, she turned. The cub followed. Together, they melted into the trees like morning fog. Ward stood frozen, then exhaled, like someone surfacing from a world underwater. "My God," he whispered. "That wasn't fear. That wasn't wild instinct." He stammered. "That was a choice," Luke finished, his eyes steady on Ward's. "I need to document this," Ward said. Luke only shook his head. "No." Ward looked stunned. This could change everything. Luke's gaze softened, but his words were steel. "Exactly." That evening, they sat across from each other in Luke's old cabin. Ward held the memory card in his hand. 3 perfect photos. Unmistakable proof. The fire crackled in the stove. Outside, the wind moved gently through the branches, like breath. Ward stared at the flames, card still in hand. "You really believe they remember?" he asked. Luke nodded. "I believe they never forgot." Ward looked down, then, without another word, leaned forward and set the card into the fire. No one spoke in that moment, but the message was clear as wind through the trees. Some truths aren't meant to be revealed. The first storm of the season came not with window-rattling thunder, but with a deep, rolling growl. the kind that reverberated through your ribs and warned that something was coming. All week, Luke had noticed the signs. Snow melting faster than usual, rivers swelling, stretches of Trail 17 flooding in places that hadn't seen water in years. But it wasn't the rising water that worried him. It was the lives that moved within the forest. He laced up his boots just as the first bolt of lightning split the horizon. No gun, no radio, just instinct and a length of rope. By the time he reached the high ridge near the old junction above Miner's Hollow, the rain was pouring in sheets and the familiar creek had turned into a raging torrent. And then, downriver, he saw it. A flash of brown spinning in the current, small, desperate, fighting. It was her, the young bear, no longer a tiny cub but still far too small to survive this flood. She was being swept downstream, slammed against a jammed log acting like a makeshift dam. Luke didn't think. He ran. Sliding down the muddy bank, heart pounding, breath ragged, he reached the water's edge. The current nearly ripped his footing out from under him, but he moved forward, tying one end of the rope around a pine trunk, the other looped around his own body. And he jumped. The cold hit him like a hammer to the chest, turning his limbs to stone. The current flipped him, spun him, dragged him. But he clawed forward, kicking, thrashing, closing the gap. She clung to the log, eyes wide with panic and spray, but she didn't fight. She just watched him. When Luke reached her, she let him slip an arm around her shoulder. He gripped the rope and shouted, not in fear, but in defiance. Not today. Not me. The river fought, but Luke fought harder, inch by inch, until his feet found rock, until they both crawled their way back onto the bank. And there they lay, man and bear, soaked, trembling, wordless, just breathing, just surviving. When he finally looked up, she was there, the mother bear. At the ridge above, rain cascading down her fur. She didn't move forward, didn't growl. She simply watched. Her breath misted into the stormy air, and Luke knew she had seen everything. Slowly, he stood, pulling the young bear upright beside him. She leaned into him, as if her bones had decided to trust. Together, they climbed, and when they reached solid ground, the mother bear was gone. That night, Luke didn't return to his cabin. He stayed at the old ranger station, built a roaring fire, and sat beside its flickering light through the dark. The young bear curled up beneath the eaves, just outside the open doorway. Not inside, but close enough to feel the warmth of the fire, and of him. She wasn't afraid. She didn't flee. She just slept, deep and peaceful, as if she knew she was safe, as if she knew she had survived. By dawn, the rain had finally ended. Luke opened the door wide. She stood, glanced at him once, then slowly turned and walked back into the forest. Quiet, strong, free. That summer came late. The snow lingered, leaving the trails heavy and breathless, like the forest itself was waking from a long dream. Luke walked them one last time. Not as a ranger, but as someone preparing to leave the only place that had ever truly felt like home. Weeks earlier, he had submitted his resignation. No announcement, no farewell party, just a signature and a set of keys left neatly on the duty desk. People in town whispered that Luke changed. They weren't wrong, but they didn't know the half of it. Some stories aren't meant for the news. Some truths are meant to stay in the woods, where no one asks for explanations. On his final day, Luke left the old cabin with only a backpack, a worn leather journal, and the same small pouch that had been part of a silent ritual for months. He hadn't planned to stop at the clearing off Trail 17, but his feet carried him there anyway. Muscle memory, now written into bone. When he reached the stone where he'd once placed the pouch, he saw something had changed. Not the trees, not the sounds, not the dappled light of a path he knew by heart. It was what waited on the stone. 12 river stones, arranged in a perfect circle. In the center, a cracked pine cone bursting with seeds. And next to it, something wholly out of place in the wild, his ranger badge. It hadn't fallen there. It had been placed. Carefully, deliberately, with reverence. Luke froze, as if he'd brushed a flame. The air thickened, holy, wordless, but clear in his chest. Then, from the forest's edge, a shadow stirred. The mother bear stepped into view, her fur silvered now around the muzzle, her pace slower, more dignified. No longer the wary creature from before, but something calmer, wiser. She didn't approach. She simply stood there, watching. No threat, no fear, only presence. Luke stood still, his heartbeat slowing to match the rhythm of the forest. And finally, he did the only thing that felt right. He knelt, bowed his head, and whispered, "Thank you." She blinked once, then turned, vanishing once more into the woods like she'd never been there at all. What do you do when nature sends you a sign? When a wild creature doesn't look at you with instinct, but with trust? If this story made you pause, reflect, or feel something you can't quite name, subscribe, hit like, and share it with someone who still believes in the bond between humans and the wild.